Hi, and it is good to be back with you guys for today's devotional as we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 3 through 4. So we're only looking at two verses today, but there's a lot of power in what Paul is saying within these two verses. Now, we're in the final chapter of 2 Corinthians, and Paul's focus here at the end of his letter is to give some final warnings to the Corinthians before he visits again. And to get some better context, we do need to look at verse 2, because verse 3 just kind of has us jumping into the middle of Paul's sentence. So in verse 2, Paul says, I warned those who sinned before and all the others, and I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not spare them. Now, there's a couple things we can see here. First, Paul's giving two warnings. And the first warning Paul gave was on his second visit to Corinth, and his second warning is in this letter. And the second warning, it's not meant to replace the first one, it's actually meant to reinforce it. It's like a cumulative warning. Also, something to notice is that there are two groups within the church that Paul's warning. The first group Paul addresses in the beginning of verse 2 when he says, those who sinned before. Now, these were the people who, in spite of being warned, persisted in their patterns of sinning during Paul's second visit, while he was actually in Corinth. But right after that, Paul gives us another group when he says, and all the others. Now, this is definitely, it's a bit unclear on who Paul's addressing, but it's most likely those in the church who had fallen into sin after Paul left from his second visit. So now the end of verse 2 and going into verse 3, Paul says that if I come again, I will not spare them, since you seek proof that Christ is speaking in me. He is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful among you. So at this point, we can see why Paul is not going to spare them a punishment if he were going to visit them again. There were patterns of ongoing, unrepentant sin, but there were also those who were continually calling for the validation of his ministry. And these are people within the church that saw God's power through Paul in his previous visits. Despite this, the false apostles were somehow able to manipulate the people into questioning Paul's authority. I don't know how that's possible. What surprises me is the fact that these false apostles, they had no power, they had no authority, and they were unable to do any of the supernatural works that Paul had performed. Yet they were still able to cause many in the church to question Paul's apostolic authority. So we have to see here that when Paul says he will not spare them, he's holding the rebellious and unrepentant sinners in the Corinthian church accountable for the sake of the community's spiritual health. But here's the struggle. The community's spiritual health depends on the Corinthians having a right relationship to God's true apostle, not the false ones. And we know that true apostle is Paul. God was speaking directly through Paul, and it was completely to their benefit to see and believe that. And if that relationship was right and healthy, it would mean that they would listen to Paul's admonishment and reject all the false apostles who were causing so much division within the church. Paul's discipline was meant for the spiritual health of the Corinthian church. He knew if they continued listening to these false apostles, it would lead to their destruction, and that broke Paul's heart. So Paul's discipline, again, came from a place of love, just like the discipline of the Lord does for his children. You know, so many times when we experience discipline, we can mistake it for punishment. And when we do that, when we perceive it as punishment instead of discipline, I think we miss out on some of the most beautiful communion with God. Because according to Scripture, discipline comes from a loving Father, and it's always meant to correct. It's not punitive, it's meant to correct. Proverbs 3:11-12 says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. Having the Lord discipline you is evidence that he loves you perfectly and that you belong to him. It's actually a beautiful aspect of the assurance of salvation that we can have, because God only does this for those who are his blood-bought children. And the result of this discipline? Well, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. That's what Hebrews 12:11 says. Listen, spiritual maturity is going to welcome discipline, however difficult it is, because discipline corrects us. It draws us back to communion with the Lord, and it trains us to grow in holiness and righteousness. So as we've seen Paul look to discipline the church out of love, we know the Lord does the same to all those who belong to him. Now, I know it's tough, but I think it's revealing of our hearts if we're willing to ask the Lord to discipline us if it's needed. Now, my encouragement is if you find that you happen to be in a season where you know the Lord's disciplining you, take joy in that. because it is evidence that he is loving you and bringing you back into correct alignment, and it's for your good, for his glory and for your good. One of the things that I think it's important, is I pray that the Lord would do whatever is necessary in my life to ensure that when I see him, I will hear the words, "Job well done, my good and faithful servant." And I know there's going to be some discipline in there. And I know it's going to be unpleasant. It's not going to be fun, but it is worth it. And I want to encourage you with that today. Be willing to listen for the Lord's voice. And if he is doing a work to reprove and admonish you, embrace it. It's because he loves you. All right, God bless you guys. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.